Picture this. You're curled up on the couch on a quiet Sunday evening, and the familiar, gentle melody of a beloved television-themed song begins to play. A little girl with pigtails runs across a grassy hillside, tumbling and laughing without a care in the world. For millions of families across America, that image meant one thing and one thing only: it was time for Little House on the Prairie. For nearly a decade, from 1974 to 1983, this show was more than just television. It was a weekly ritual. A warm hug from the screen. A reminder that even in the toughest of times, family, faith, and love could carry you through anything. But here's the thing about television magic: it's exactly that. Magic. And like all magic tricks, when you look closely enough, you start to see the strings. The trapdoors. The sleight of hand. Because behind that idyllic portrait of 19th century pioneer life, there were bloopers that slipped through the editing room, behind-the-scenes secrets that never made it to air, and personal stories from the cast that were anything but simple or wholesome. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on all of it. So whether you grew up watching Laura Ingalls race Nellie Oleson down the main street of Walnut Grove, or you stumbled onto the show through late-night reruns, buckle up. Because we're about to take a long, hard look at the moments that weren't edited out, the mistakes that made it to your screen, and the off-camera reality that the producers definitely didn't want you thinking about while you were watching Pa Ingalls deliver yet another life lesson by the fireplace. This is everything you never knew about Little House on the Prairie, and trust us, it's a lot more interesting than a simple wagon ride through the Minnesota countryside. Let's start with the fun stuff, the bloopers and continuity errors that sharp-eyed fans have been talking about for decades. When you're producing over 200 episodes of television across 9 seasons, mistakes are going to happen. That's just the reality of filmmaking. But some of the goofs in Little House on the Prairie are so wonderfully absurd that they deserve their own spotlight. Take, for instance, one of the most talked about visual mistakes in the entire series. In at least 2 separate episodes, The Monster of Walnut Grove and The Music Box, viewers who pay close attention will notice something odd happening outside the upstairs window next to the girl's bed. Tree branches. Rustling, swaying, creaking tree branches that look like they're in the middle of a windstorm. That might not sound like a big deal until you realize that in virtually every other scene shot from outside or around that same house, there is no tree anywhere near that window. None. It simply doesn't exist. The branches appear to have come from stock footage or a sound effect used to set an atmospheric mood, and nobody caught it before it went to air. Somewhere in an editing room in Hollywood, somebody definitely had a rough week when fans started pointing that one out. Then there's the traveling quilt. Now, quilts were an important part of pioneer life. Families made them by hand, they were passed down through generations, and they carried enormous sentimental value. So it's a little funny that the show's prop department apparently felt comfortable letting one particular quilt wander freely through the entire Walnut Grove community. This white quilt with its distinctive double wedding ring style pattern keeps popping up in the most unexpected places. One episode, it's on the Olsen family's bed. Another episode, it's draped over an entirely different household. It migrates from bedroom to bedroom like it has somewhere to be. Fans with a sharp eye and a good memory started cataloging its appearances, and the total number of locations that quilt visited across the series is genuinely impressive for an inanimate piece of fabric. But perhaps the most jaw-dropping blooper in the show's history involves a real historical figure showing up in a place he absolutely had no business being. In a Season 8 episode called Wave of the Future, a storyline unfolds around Nellie's restaurant getting turned into a franchise operation. The episode deals with contracts, business, and the complications of giving up creative control of something you've built. It's actually a pretty interesting episode. But then, Colonel Sanders shows up. Yes, that Colonel Sanders. The founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, in his iconic white suit, offering Harriet Olsen a chicken franchise deal. On the surface, it sounds like a fun celebrity cameo. Except for one enormous problem. The show is set in the 1870s and 1880s. Colonel Sanders wasn't even born until 1890. And Kentucky Fried Chicken as a company didn't exist until 1952. So the show essentially featured a man offering a business deal roughly 70 years before he was born. Nobody on the production team apparently stopped to check the timeline before that scene made it to broadcast. And while we're on the subject of time not quite adding up, let's talk about the grand finale. The final episode of Little House on the Prairie is titled The Last Farewell, and it's set in the year 1901. That means it takes place more than a decade after the events of the previous season. By any logical reckoning, the adult characters who were in their 30s and 40s during the main series should now be pushing 60 or 70. In real history, the actual Charles Ingalls passed away in 1902, just 1 year after the events depicted in the finale. And the children who appeared in the later seasons, Carrie, Jenny, James, Cassandra, and the rest, should logically have grown into adults with their own lives by this point. But the show just doesn't account for any of that. Nobody aged. Nobody changed. Time, it seems, was completely optional in Walnut Grove. One of the more physically obvious bloopers appears in a Season 5 episode called The Odyssey. In a gripping action sequence, a character is thrown off a moving train. It's supposed to be a tense, dangerous moment that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Except, if you watch the scene slowly and carefully, you can see it quite clearly. The figure being thrown from the train is not a person at all. It's a dummy. A mannequin. The dummy lands stiffly in the grass while the actual stuntman rolls safely down a nearby hill, somehow ending up further away from the train than the dummy he was supposed to represent. It's one of those moments that completely breaks the tension the scene was building, and once you see it, you absolutely cannot unsee it. And then there's the pregnancy that lasted over a year. According to Melissa Gilbert herself, who played Laura Ingalls, her character's pregnancy storyline was stretched out to an almost comical degree. Laura first revealed she was expecting during a warm weather season. Audiences watched and waited, and the seasons changed, and summer came around again, and Laura was still pregnant. More than 12 months passed within the show's timeline before the pregnancy resolved. For a show that prided itself on realistic depictions of family life, that particular biological stretch was quite something. Now let's talk fashion. Or more accurately, the fashion that had absolutely no business being in a show set in the 1870s and 1880s. One of the most common mistakes in historical dramas is anachronistic clothing, and Little House on the Prairie was not immune to this particular pitfall. The costume department did a remarkable job overall, but some details slipped through that would make a historian raise an eyebrow or two. In several episodes, Caroline Ingalls can be seen wearing what appears to be a bra. This sounds like a minor detail, but it's actually a significant one. The modern bra was not invented until 1912. The women of Walnut Grove in the 1870s would have been wearing entirely different undergarments, and the outline visible beneath Caroline's clothing in those scenes simply doesn't belong in that era. Then there are the perms. Across multiple episodes, several female characters sport curly, perfectly waved hairstyles that look far more like they belong in a 1970s beauty salon than on a prairie farm in the 1880s. The irony, of course, is that the show was being filmed in the 1970s, and that decade's aesthetic clearly bled into the costume and hair design more than the production team might have intended. Melissa Gilbert has actually spoken about this herself, acknowledging that her own hair throughout the series was often too long and too modern for what a young girl growing up in frontier Minnesota would realistically have worn. But the most fascinating hair story on the set of Little House on the Prairie doesn't belong to any of the female cast members. It belongs to Michael Landon himself. Landon's dark, curly hair was one of his most recognizable features, thick, voluminous, and seemingly effortless. Fans assumed it was completely natural. It was not. His actual hair color was a considerably more muted, ashy brown, and the dark, rich tone that audiences saw on screen came entirely from regular dye appointments with a professional stylist. Landon took his hair color extremely seriously and was very particular about maintaining it. The problem, though, was that as Landon got older and a few gray hairs began to appear, something unexpected started happening under the bright lights of the set and in direct sunlight. The dye would react to the lighting conditions and take on a distinctly purple tint. Not subtle lavender. Actually purple. This happened often enough that the production team had to bring in professional colorists specifically to correct the issue, ensuring that Pa Ingalls wasn't accidentally walking around Walnut Grove with a head of purplish hair. It was one of those open set secrets that everyone knew about but nobody talked about on camera. Here is where things get genuinely interesting, because the stories happening off camera during Little House on the Prairie were sometimes just as dramatic, and occasionally far more so, than anything that was scripted. Let's begin with the friendship that was born from a rivalry. On screen, Laura Ingalls and Nellie Oleson were enemies. Genuine, hair-pulling, name-calling, dress-ruining enemies. Their feud was the engine that powered countless storylines across the series, and audiences loved every minute of their clashes. Nellie was the spoiled, sneering daughter of privilege, and Laura was the scrappy, honest girl from the farm, and the show milked their antagonism for all it was worth. What the show never told you, however, was that Melissa Gilbert and Allison Arngrim, the two actresses bringing those characters to life, were, in reality, the closest of friends. Off camera, the two girls were inseparable. They spent their free time together, had sleepovers at each other's houses, and generally behaved like the best of childhood friends rather than bitter television rivals. In a way, their friendship makes their on-screen performances even more impressive. To spend your days genuinely enjoying someone's company and then step in front of a camera and completely convince an audience of millions that you can't stand each other, that takes real acting ability, especially for two young girls who were still developing their craft. Their friendship also led to one of the more memorable behind-the-scenes pranks in the show's history. Michael Landon, the show's star, director, writer, and general force of nature, was well known on set for his love of practical jokes. He was the kind of person who kept the atmosphere light and fun, and the rest of the cast picked up his energy. Melissa and Allison, inspired by Landon's mischievous spirit, once wrapped a toilet on set in clear plastic wrap, a classic prank that, predictably, caused exactly the kind of chaos they were hoping for. But Landon himself was the real master of the art. Rachel Greenbush, who played the youngest Ingalls sibling Carrie, once recalled in an interview that during breaks from filming, she and Melissa Gilbert used to go down to a nearby creek and catch frogs. They would bring them back to Landon, who would then do something absolutely unhinged with them. He would put the frogs in his mouth, walk up to unsuspecting cast and crew members with an innocent expression on his face, and then open wide, letting the frog leap out directly at the startled person. The resulting screams and chaos apparently never got old for him. He did this repeatedly and found it hilarious every single time. Not every relationship on set was as warm as the Landon-Gilbert father-daughter dynamic, though. For every story of friendship and laughter, there was another one of genuine friction and long-standing tension. The most well-documented feud on the Little House set was between Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson, who played Mary Ingalls, Laura's older sister. On screen, the two girls had a warm, believable sibling bond. Mary and Laura bickered occasionally the way real sisters do, but they were fundamentally on each other's side, and audiences found their relationship deeply relatable. Behind the scenes, however, the two actresses genuinely did not get along, and their dislike for each other wasn't a passing irritation, it lasted for the full 9 years of the show's run. Melissa Gilbert later wrote about the situation in her memoir, describing Anderson as cold and distant, someone who kept herself removed from the rest of the cast. Gilbert didn't sugarcoat her feelings on the matter. She found Anderson's behavior hurtful and difficult to understand, and the distance between them never closed, even as the years went on. Interestingly, Gilbert wasn't alone in this perception. Multiple cast members reportedly noted that Anderson was hard to connect with, slow to warm up, and generally kept to herself in ways that others found off-putting. Melissa Sue Anderson, for her part, never really gave her side of the story in any detailed way, which means the full picture of what happened between them remains incomplete. Some observers have speculated that Anderson's upbringing may have played a role. She had a very protective mother and a sheltered home life, which might have made navigating the social dynamics of a busy television set genuinely difficult for her. Whatever the true cause, the rift between the two Melissas was real, it was lasting, and it stood in quiet contrast to the loving sisterhood they portrayed every week for television audiences across the country. Then there's the story of Jonathan Gilbert, who played Willie Olson on the show. In real life, Jonathan was Melissa Gilbert's adopted brother. They shared a last name for a reason. Their on-screen relationship mirrored their real one in some ways, with the playful sibling energy that Jonathan and Melissa brought to their characters feeling genuinely lived in. Sadly, however, whatever closeness they shared as children and as young actors did not survive into adulthood. The two became estranged after the show ended, and Melissa has spoken openly about the sadness of that estrangement. Jonathan left the entertainment world entirely, earned an MBA in finance, and built a career as a stockbroker in New York, a completely different life from his childhood on a television prairie. No conversation about Little House on the Prairie is complete without spending real time on Michael Landon, because the man was complicated in ways that make his legacy genuinely fascinating. To the public, Landon was par Ingalls, patient, strong, loving, and morally upright. He was the kind of father figure that families across America looked up to, a steady and reassuring presence at the center of a beloved show. What the public didn't know, at least not for a long time, was that the man playing that role was carrying a significant amount of personal darkness alongside all that charm. According to multiple accounts, including Melissa Gilbert's memoir, Michael Landon had a serious and long-standing struggle with alcohol. He would reportedly begin his day with a cup of coffee that had been generously spiked with liquor, and the drinks would continue from there throughout the working day. Most people on set didn't fully grasp the scale of his drinking because he was functional. He was working, directing, performing, and managing the production, all while consuming a significant amount of alcohol. The crew, by multiple accounts, also developed a culture around alcohol on the set. Stories circulated that the production team would go through cases of beer on regular days, with particularly stressful days earning the nickname three-case days. It was a different era in Hollywood, and the boundaries around what was acceptable on a working set were considerably looser than they would be today. Landon's personal life also generated significant controversy during the show's run. For many years, he was married, and his family image matched perfectly with the wholesome patriarch he played on screen. But during the later seasons of Little House, Landon began a relationship with Cindy Clerico, a makeup artist on the production. He eventually left his wife for her. For Melissa Gilbert, this was deeply painful. Her own parents had divorced when she was only 8 years old, and she had found in Landon a kind of surrogate father, a stable, dependable male figure who told her he loved her like a daughter. Learning that he had chosen to blow up his family felt, to her, like a personal betrayal, and she cut off contact with him for a period of time as a result. The estrangement didn't last forever, though. When Landon was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Melissa chose to reconcile with him, setting aside the hurt of the previous years to be present for someone she had once loved like a parent. He died in 1991 at the age of 54, and the loss was enormous for everyone who had worked with him. Melissa Gilbert honored his memory in a deeply personal way. She named one of her own children Michael in his honor. What many people also didn't know about Landon was something far more private: his real name and background. Michael Landon was a stage name. He was born Eugene Maurice Horowitz, the son of a Jewish father named Eli Maurice Horowitz and a Catholic mother named Peggy O'Neill. He grew up between New York and New Jersey, celebrated his bar mitzvah at Temple Beth Shalom, and identified culturally as Jewish throughout his life, even while playing a devoutly Christian character on screen week after week. Landon was open about the fact that he didn't practice any particular religion personally. He believed in God but didn't adhere to any formal faith tradition, but he never denied or downplayed his Jewish cultural identity. The fact that the man who so powerfully portrayed frontier Christianity on screen was himself Jewish is one of those quietly interesting contradictions that says something meaningful about what acting actually is. His early life was genuinely difficult. Landon was born in Forest Hills in Queens, New York, and his childhood was shaped in large part by the instability of his home life. His mother struggled seriously with mental health, and Landon has spoken about the fear and anxiety he carried as a child, always worried about what might happen next. On one occasion, he reportedly had to pull his mother back from the water during a family beach trip when she tried to harm herself. The psychological toll of growing up in that kind of environment left marks, including a period of childhood bedwetting that his mother handled in the most humiliating way possible, putting his wet sheets outside the window for the neighborhood to see. It's a painful detail that humanizes Landon in ways that the glossy image of Pa Ingalls never could. One of the things that often gets lost when people talk about Little House on the Prairie is just how genuinely bold the show was for its time. On the surface, it looked like gentle, family-friendly fare about bonnets and butter churning and lessons learned by candlelight. But scratch below the surface and you find a show that was willing to go places that most television programs in the 1970s and early 1980s simply refused to go. Over its 9-season run, Little House took on sexual assault, drug addiction, racism, alcoholism, disability, adoption, poverty, and the very real and very difficult realities of grief and loss. These weren't quick, cautious gestures toward difficult subjects. The show devoted full episodes and multi-part storylines to exploring these themes with real depth. At a time when television was largely in the business of keeping things pleasant and unchallenging, Little House was quietly doing something more ambitious. There's an argument to be made that the show's wholesome exterior was actually part of what allowed it to tackle these subjects. Because audiences trusted the Ingalls family, because they felt safe and comfortable with these characters, the show could use the goodwill to lead viewers into difficult territory that they might have resisted from another program. It was subversive in the most gentle possible way, and the fact that it connected with so many families across such a wide range of backgrounds suggests that the approach worked. Here's something that surprises a lot of people: Walnut Grove is a real place. The small town where the Ingalls family lived in the show actually exists in Redwood County, Minnesota. The real Walnut Grove was founded in 1874 and incorporated in 1879, and the real Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the series of autobiographical books that inspired the television show, did indeed live there for several years of her childhood. The town today is small, very small, with a population of just over 800 people and a land area of roughly 1 square mile. But it takes its connection to the Little House legacy seriously, and visitors who make the trip to southwestern Minnesota will find a community that has embraced its place in American literary and television history. The books themselves came from a remarkable life. Laura Ingalls Wilder was born in 1867, and her family began their westward journey when she was just 3 years old, eventually settling in various locations across Kansas, Minnesota, and the Dakota Territory before she grew up, married Almanzo Wilder, and built a life of her own. Her decision, later in life, to write down the stories of her childhood produced one of the most enduring series of books in American literature, stories that a man named Ed Friendly eventually read and decided deserved to be seen on television. The show that resulted premiered on September 11, 1974, and ran for 8 full seasons before transitioning into a 9th and final season under the title Little House, A New Beginning. Over the course of more than 200 episodes, it became a fixture in American homes and a cultural touchstone that continues to resonate decades after its conclusion. When the show finally ended, its cast went in very different directions, and some of those paths were surprising. Melissa Gilbert continued working as an actress and eventually stepped into a leadership role in the industry, serving as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 2001 to 2005. She later entered the political arena, running as the Democratic candidate for Michigan's 8th congressional district in 2016. It was a serious campaign. She was considered the likely Democratic nominee for her district, but she was forced to withdraw due to injuries sustained in an accident years earlier. Her post-Prairie career was defined by a willingness to try new things and take on new challenges, even when they carried significant personal risk. Her adopted brother Jonathan Gilbert, who played Willie Olson with such cheerful mischief, left the entertainment world completely behind. He earned his MBA in finance and built a quiet, private life as a stockbroker in New York. The contrast between his childhood in the spotlight and his adult life working in financial markets is as sharp as any character transformation the show ever depicted. Michael Landon left behind 9 children, to each of whom he arranged to leave between $8 and $10 million. His son, Michael Landon Jr., followed his father into the entertainment industry and has had a successful career as a producer and director in his own right, carrying the family legacy forward in the medium that defined his father's life. Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls with such quiet grace and strength, continued acting after the show ended, appearing in productions including Harry's War and Wyatt Epp. She remained connected to the industry but never again had a role that matched the cultural prominence of Caroline Ingalls. Her career after the Prairie was steady and professional, even if it never recaptured the extraordinary platform the show had given her. Allison Arngrim, who created one of television's most memorably entertaining villains in Nellie Oleson, has remained one of the most openly candid and engaging voices from the show's legacy. She has written about her experiences on the series with genuine humor and honesty, and her reflections on the cast, the production, and the culture of the set have become some of the most quoted sources of behind-the-scenes information about the show. The way Little House on the Prairie ended deserves its own chapter, because it was genuinely unusual for a beloved family show. As the series neared its conclusion, Michael Landon made a decision that was dramatic, final, and completely in keeping with his character as a storyteller who did things his own way. Rather than simply letting the show fade out, or ending with a quiet, nostalgic final episode, Landon chose to end things with an act of spectacular destruction. In The Last Farewell, the residents of Walnut Grove, faced with the threat of losing their town to outside interests who have claimed the land, decide to blow it up rather than hand it over. The buildings, the homes, everything the community had built, gone, in a series of explosions that left viewers somewhere between stunned and grieving. It was a bold choice. Some fans loved it for its defiance and its refusal to go gently. Others found it devastating in a way they hadn't been prepared for. What's certain is that it left a mark, and it ensured that the ending of Little House on the Prairie would be discussed and debated long after the screen went dark. Landon himself explained that the decision was partly about ownership, the idea that the people who built something have the right to determine its fate, and that no external force can take away what a community has created together. It was a very Michael Landon kind of ending. Dramatic, principled, and completely unafraid of leaving an audience with complicated feelings. Little House on the Prairie was never quite what it appeared to be. On the surface, it was a simple, warm story about a simple, warm family living a simple, warm life in a simpler time. But underneath that surface was a production full of complicated people doing complicated things, making mistakes, forming unexpected friendships, carrying private struggles, and pouring themselves into something that turned out to matter far more than any of them probably anticipated when they first walked onto that set in 1974. The bloopers, the behind-the-scenes feuds, the personal struggles, the off-camera romances and estrangements and reconciliations, none of it diminishes what the show was and what it meant to the people who loved it. If anything, knowing that the cast and crew were human beings with all the messiness that entails makes the warmth they managed to create on screen even more remarkable. They were people doing their best, making something beautiful and enduring, even on the days when everything was difficult. So next time you watch an episode and you spot that wandering quilt, or notice Carrie tumbling down that hillside a little too enthusiastically, or wonder how on earth Colonel Sanders ended up in 1870s Minnesota, just smile. Because that's what Little House on the Prairie always was at its heart. A little bit imperfect. A whole lot of heart. And completely, utterly unforgettable. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment below, we'd love to know what your favorite Little House memory is. We'll see you in the next one.